Hello, I'm Jim Halfpenny, and I welcome you to a Gathering of Naturalists. The gathering is hosted by a Naturalist World, an ecological education company located at the north entrance to Yellowstone National Park. Our company sponsors educational programs and research in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. We also host this free lecture series, A Gathering of Naturalists, which highlights the knowledge and expertise of those who live, study, and love the ecosystem. Now, please join us for our program. Well, tonight's program is going to be on grizzlies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tyler Brasington. Tyler and I have been getting ourselves in trouble together for quite a few years now. The link between the two of us getting in trouble, of course, is the bears, in particular the grizzly bears. And with that, Tyler, we're going to set you up. If you'll share your screen, you will be on.
All righty.
Screen is up.
Very good.
And we can hear you.
Awesome. So I'm Tyler Brasington, currently a graduate student at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, getting my master's in natural resources. As Jim had previously mentioned, I've been working with him for several years now on various topics related to grizzly bear ecology, bear charts, a lot of different projects with Jim, and he's served as a great mentor over the years that we've worked. The title of my presentation tonight is The Bear Necessities. I kind of pulled that title from the Jungle Book. I thought it was clever and catchy instead of the boring typical topics in grizzly bear ecology or, conservation topics. I wanted to come up with something clever. And so tonight, what we're going to be talking about, reproductive anomalies, grizzly bear ecology, conservation reliance, and then of course, the life of the famous and very well-known grizzly bear 399. And so just a brief introduction about myself. Like I had mentioned previously, I'm going to school at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, working on my master's there right now. Previously, I graduated from the University of Wisconsin Whitewater in 2017. During my time at Whitewater, I was fortunate enough to be selected to present some of my research that I had worked with Jim on at the National Conference for Undergraduate Research at the University of Memphis. And that presentation was spatial relationships and demographics of grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park. I did a residency in nature program with Jim during 2016, where we worked together on mapping the distribution of grizzly bears in the northern range of Yellowstone. And that actually resulted in a publication. I served as a teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin Whitewater for the University of Wisconsin Whitewater Yellowstone Travel Study. Each year, George Clokey brings 2 classes out to Yellowstone National Park and provides an opportunity for students to learn about the Yellowstone ecosystem and the various topics such as ecology. He used to do a winter study. And so aside from that, I have also served as an undergraduate mentor to several students who are currently attending the University of Wisconsin Whitewater. The 3 students that I'm working with are in geography, environmental science, and the biology department. And so this is a picture of nearly 800 peer-reviewed articles on grizzly bears. This is what graduate coursework looks like. It's a lot of reading. And so I just thought that was kind of a funny picture to include here. My career trajectory. So currently I work in Grand Teton National Park. I've worked since 2017 as a seasonal employee. I started off with the fisheries and aquatic invasive species area. I was a biological science technician and then eventually made the transition to bear management in the Wildlife Brigade. And I've been serving in that role since 2019. Previously in 2017, I also worked a dual role. I would come up to Yellowstone on my off days and work in the bear management office out of Lake. And I worked with Eric Reinertson. And so before I even worked in Grand Teton again, I had a period where I took a little exodus and I worked in Madison, Wisconsin for the U.S. Geological Survey at the National Wildlife Health Center. And that was from 2017 to 2019. I was a biological science technician there working with taking care of various species involved with research, vampire bats, little brown bats, big brown bats, a lot of small mammals. Some of the most important research that I assisted with there focused on white nose syndrome and little brown bats. And we also conducted a rabies study. And so after I worked at the U.S. Geological Survey, I returned to Grand Teton. I was working in bear management wildlife brigade role. And once my season ended, I went back to Wisconsin and actually served in the capacity for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, working for the Vegetable Crops Research Unit. It's funny, I went from working with bears to carrots. It was a pretty stiff transition. But in that role, I was basically reviewing manuscripts before they went off to be peer reviewed by major journals. And so I learned a lot about carrots. I learned a lot about potatoes. Now I'm back in Grand Teton National Park, and that's where I hope to stay for years to come. Bears are obviously my passion. And so really, what are we going to talk about tonight? I kind of alluded to some of this earlier on my cover slide. We're going to talk about what's so great about grizzly bears, basics on their ecology, their biology, nutrition and movements, reproduction, some of the unique life histories that have been documented in the Greater Yellowstone. We're going to talk about bear brains and the neurology, sleeping holes, or where bears den during the winter and hibernate. Talk about ongoing research in the GYE. We're going to talk about conservation reliance, which is a term probably unfamiliar to some. A fed bear was not always a dead bear. We're going to talk about some of the history before the garbage dumps were closed in Yellowstone National Park. And then we're going to talk about conflict resolution, the future of the grizzlies, and most of all, we're going to talk about everybody's beloved Grizzly 399. And so what's so great about bears? What is so special about Yellowstone grizzly bears? And really, it's the recovery. It's the recovery, the conservation success. Undoubtedly, the recovery of grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is probably one of the greatest conservation successes of our lifetime. And so it can't go unnoted. In the Craighead era of research, so between 1959 and 1970, that 12-year period, the Craigheads really were the pioneers for grizzly bear research and for radio tracking. And they paved the way for future research and conservation efforts to follow for what is now referred to as the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. And so grizzly bears are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so they were first listed in 1975. They were struck down in 2007, relisted in 2009, and delisted in 2017, and then relisted in 2018. I like to refer to it as the boomerang effect. And it's actually something that I wrote a paper on for my master's. The boomerang effect, it's just been this seesaw effect of back and forth as far as policy goes. Another two things that are relevant to grizzly bears are the conservation management strategy and the Greater Yellowstone Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan. And so the Greater Yellowstone Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan was established in 1993. It was revised as, I believe the last time it was revised was 2006. And this is the management strategy for when grizzly bears are under endangered species protections. So that's what drives and basically drives the ship when it comes to management while they're under these protections. The conservation management strategy, this is the strategy for when bears are delisted. So once we come to that point where grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone are delisted from the federal protections, they will fall under the conservation management strategy. And this strategy will be turning the management over to the tri-state area, the tri-state area being Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And so those game and fish agencies would resume control of grizzly bears in their individual states. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team will continue monitoring because bears are a conservation reliant species. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And so what are some basics on bear ecology? Their senses, their vision, and their hearing. So vision, when you think about bears in comparison to humans, humans primarily rely on vision as their predominant sense, whereas bears will rely on their sense of smell. Bears do have excellent vision, contrary to what a lot of people believe. They've got excellent night vision. It's comparable to that of humans. Their hearing, they can hear into the ultrasonic range. So 16 to 20 megahertz, maybe even higher potentially. Their weight, males on average weigh about 413 pounds, the heaviest being 715. And please note that this is just what we have on record. There could be bears out there that are much heavier that just have not been handled and documented. Females on average, 269 pounds, heaviest female documented, 436. If we want to put that into perspective, 399 in some of these other female bears can be up to 355 pounds to 400 pounds when it comes into late fall. And that's even having cubs. And I guess on a more fun note, we did have a male bear that came out of hibernation, and we captured him in the month of May, and that bear weighed 556 pounds, which is pretty remarkable that they're able to maintain that weight coming out of the den. Typically June is when bears will have the lowest body fat percentage, and that'll gradually rebound as they start to pack on more pounds throughout the summer, going into the fall. Strength. So bears are about 2.5 to 5 times stronger than a human being. Their average claw length is about 2 inches. The longest that a grizzly bear's claws can get have been documented up to 6 inches. So think about a dollar bill. It's pretty ridiculous. Bears can run 35 to 40 miles an hour. In comparison, the fastest man on earth, Usain Bolt, can only run 28. So really, Usain Bolt can't even outrun a bear. Bears are promiscuous. So multiple males will mate with females. Females can mate with multiple males. And multiple males can sire a litter of cubs with one female. So in the case of 399 with her 4 cubs, 2 of those cubs could belong to one male and 2 could belong to another, or 3 could belong to one and 1 might belong to another. That is possible, and that has been documented in her lineage. And so bears are driven by the 3 S's, which are sex, sustenance, and security. And so sex being the ability to produce offspring, sustenance, the ability to acquire resources on the landscape in order to survive, and then security, being able to do all of the above, and more so with females with cubs, being able to provide security to their cubs. And so nutrition and diet. So nutrition and diet are the main factors which influence grizzly bear movements. Grizzly bears are opportunistic and they're omnivore generalists. They exhibit extreme dietary plasticity. And so what does that mean? That means that they have a very wide-ranging diet and they're able to easily shift to other food sources if something goes missing. So in a year where, let's say a bear is unable to acquire white bark pine, they might shift to false truffles. That's something that's been documented. And so the dietary plasticity and their diversity among food sources is also what is largely, it's probably the explanation why brown bears in general are so widely distributed on a global scale. And so between 1943 and 2009, during a study, was documented 266 different species, 200 genera, and 4 kingdoms. So that just speaks to the plasticity in a grizzly bear's diet. Early stages of plants are consumed. Why? It's mainly because they're high in nutrients in comparison to later growth. Typically, bears will eat the shoots, the leaves, and the stems of plants, very high in nutrients. Grizzly bears do not have a cecum. They have a very difficult time digesting cellulose, which is why the early growth stages of plants are the best for bears to eat early on, as opposed to ungulates, so mule deer, elk, they're able to digest cellulose much easier. And so nutrition and diet, there is no cookie cutter. And what I mean by this is that not every bear has the same accessibility to foods within their home range. And so that's important to note. So when people say that, well, white bark pine is going to be, a significant factor, really bears, they have such plasticity in their diets. And because not every bear has the same resources in their range, different bears might have, different pull on different resources as opposed to others. And so there is not the same accessibility for food sources in every bear's home range. And that's really important to think about. Bears exhibit directed feeding behavior, which means that they'll focus their energy foraging on high gross energy foods. And so, for example, army cutworm moths, ungulates, trout, clover, and really there's a seasonal component to that as well when it comes to the availability. The 2 figures that I've got over here on the right-hand side, we've got highest in fat, and then we've got the highest in carbohydrates. So the top is the highest in fats. White bark pine scores very high in terms of fat. It's one of the fattiest sources of that grizzly bears can consume, up to 30.5% fat. And if we look down at the bottom here for carbohydrates, onion grass bulbs. So that's where A is in the bottom right-hand corner of that image, 88.8% carbohydrates. And then we've also got berries, but there isn't nearly as many berries that rate high with carbohydrate content in comparison to some of these other food sources. But we've got yampa, we've got glacial lily, spring beauty, and biscuit root, which is available in the spring on Pilgrim Flats, if anybody's familiar with that area. And so movements and range, we kind of talked about this briefly in the previous slide, which is food really dictates the movements of bears. And so home range is really a function of resource availability. And so home ranges can be broken down by demographic. The size of the home range is really related to habitat productivity. So highly productive habitats, you'll typically have bears that will exhibit smaller home range sizes as opposed to areas where it's poor habitat, and then their home ranges will be much larger. And so several factors need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about home ranges. These include that grizzly bears are omnivorous. They primarily eat vegetation. They're not these crazy meat-eating machines. They do consume meat, but primarily their diet consists of mostly plants. And so oftentimes when bears come out from the den and they emerge in the spring, they'll first hit those low-lying areas where the snow's melted out. Those are the areas that'll first green up. Those are also the areas where they have easy accessibility to winter-killed or wolf-killed ungulate carcasses that have overwintered. For example, Blacktail Ponds in Yellowstone National Park, every year bears will appear at that site, and it's because bison will fall through and drown. There are other areas of the park. So Lahardy Rapids is another good area. Water gets really high, bison will drown, they get caught on the rapids, and bears will feed in those areas. The list goes on. Bears are not territorial. That's really important to note. And they are not migratory either. I was surprised when I saw somebody that said that bears were migratory in Grand Teton when I was working last year. And it was a publication error. And so bears are not migratory. They make seasonally recurring trips. So they recognize where they can find resources. And so they will come back to those areas to acquire those resources every year, but they are not migratory. And so movements vary depending on age and sex, really. And so we've got females with cubs of the year that will exhibit the smallest home range sizes. Males have the largest home range sizes, and subadult males and adult males do. And so typically subadult males, the reason that their areas are much larger is because of dispersal. And so basically dispersal, interestingly, it's a behavioral mechanism as a means to prevent inbreeding. And so typically with those larger bears, they're going to move out and just do their own thing. Female bears, when they first get weaned and kicked out by their mother, will stay within a maternal home range. And so there will be a spatial overlay and kind of a lot of overlap with their ranges. Grizzlies will avoid some environments. So they're going to avoid rocks, snow, because of limited food. But that doesn't exclude them from crossing those areas and that kind of habitat. But obviously you're not going to have a grizzly bear that's going to decide to go up the Grand or go up the Middle Teton. There's no food there for them. And so the movements of females with cubs of the year. So COY is a abbreviation for Cubs of the Year. And so females with cubs of the year explained. So they have the smallest home ranges because there's a lack of mobility and there's a vulnerability component for cubs. And so it's a mechanism of security for females to keep a smaller home range. They will select least preferred habitat in order to provide security for their young. And oftentimes with bears that have their first litters, it can be from a lack of experience. You get bears that are older and they have litters of cubs, and sometimes their home ranges might be slightly larger just because they've got a little bit more experience. And females with cubs may be displaced due to subordinates of the female to other bears in close proximity. or even the ignorance of vulnerability to her cubs to predation. And again, that's from lack of experience a lot of times. And so this is an interesting graphic. And so this is showing GPS locations of grizzly bear 399 and 610 from the years 2016 through 2018. And so this is the most recent time that 399 was collared. Unfortunately, during this period of time, in 2017, her collar failed. So it stopped transmitting and stopped working. So she was wearing a defunct collar for a year before it actually dropped off. On the contrary, grizzly bear 610, which is noted in the orange, we recorded over 7,000 locations between 2016 and 2018, which is pretty remarkable. And really the importance, what I want people to take away from looking at this map is look at the overlap in the areas that both bears use. This is a prime example of a female bear, using the maternal range of her mother. And even surprisingly, this year we had instances where the two were feeding in close proximity to one another. And when I say close proximity, within an arm's reach in certain capacities. And some of that I'll talk about later. The Craigheads were the first to document pair bonding in adult females with cubs. And it's a pretty interesting characteristic. And so now what everybody's been waiting for, who is Grizzly 399? Like, what is so special about this bear? Why is she so well known? And what makes her so famous? And really, Grizzly 399, the reason that she is so well known is because she is habituated and she hangs out near the roadways. And she's easily observed by park visitors and by park staff. And so she can be referred to as a matriarch, and she's a prime example of grizzly bear expansion. She is one of the first reproducing females that showed up in Grand Teton National Park. And that is really important because that signified expansion. We've got grizzly bears back down in Grand Teton that, we typically didn't see grizzly bears for quite a while. And so if we look at how old 399 is, she's 25 as of 2021, pending that she comes out of the den. The average lifespan for a wild grizzly bear is between 20 and 30 years, with the median age for a female bear at about 16. The oldest bear on record was actually documented this past summer, and that was grizzly bear 168. It was a 34-year-old male. And so how do we age these bears? How do we know that bear was 34 years old? Well, we use a technique called cementum annular aging. And this technique, it's similar to how you would age trees. So you count the rings in a tree and that tells you how old. Well, the same is applied to teeth. So you do a cross-sectional of the tooth and you count the rings and that will tell you how old the bear is. And typically what we'll use as a tooth sample for bears that are captured and processed, we will use a premolar 1. And so that is the upper premolar. We can also use a lower premolar, but typically it's an upper that we're extracting. And then that is sent off to a lab where it's a cross-sectional is run and then microscopically looked at to age. Aside from that, Grizzly 399, she's had 7 litters, accounting for 17 cubs over her lifetime. And we'll just look at some of her life history in these litters. It's pretty remarkable that she's had 7 litters. Even more so, the fact that she had a cub adoption event in 2011 with her daughter, 610. And so that in 2011, 399 gave one of her cubs to her daughter, and then 610 reared that cub through the remainder of the year and actually weaned that cub. The oldest bear to birth in the rear cubs was 25 years old. 399 was 24 years old when she had her litter of 4, and she will be 25 this year, which is pretty significant. Typically bears, once they reach 25 years of age, anything after that, they typically are deteriorating and their reproductive capabilities are dwindled. And so there have only been 14 known litters of quadruplet cubs documented in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, 3 during the Craighead era between 1959 and 1970, and then 11 since 1973 when the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team began documenting litters. And so now this is kind of the sad thing that I'm going to show on this life history. So we've got these 3 yellow X's are natural deaths. So we know that these 3 bears have died from natural causes. Now, if we're talking bears that have died at the hands of humans, we have a substantially larger quantity, unfortunately. And so a lot of these bears, they got into trouble. So we've got one of 610's cubs, 760. That bear, unfortunately, was 3 years old when it was removed. It had obtained food rewards in 2014. It had been relocated several times that year. It was hanging out in the Lizard Creek campground, and then in another residential area near Jackson. We've got 2013 where we've got a split. So we've got one bear from that 2013 litter that's still out on the landscape. 2017, 399 still got 2 bears, 2 cubs that are out on the landscape, roaming around in various areas. And so this kind of just speaks to the difference between natural mortality and deaths at the hands of humans. And so now let's talk a little bit about reproduction. And so reproduction, litter size is an essential parameter of an adult female's productivity over their life. And so survival of cubs actually increases with age. Older prime age females will produce the most litters of 2 cubs or more, typically. The greater the reproductive cycle length, the fewer litters. And this kind of ties into grizzly bears exhibit one of the lowest reproductive rates among North American terrestrial mammals. And so female grizzly bears, the reproductive cycle is typically 2.5 to 3 years. And there are several factors that can disrupt it. The loss of a litter, timing and separation, and then a delay in subsequent reproduction. Reproductive longevity for female grizzly bears in the GYE is pretty high. So females surviving into their 20s could have anywhere between 4 and 5 litters on average. Right now, the best estimate for how long it takes a female bear to replace herself in the population is about 14 years, which is it's pretty staggering. It's a really long time. Additionally, bears will typically breed in the spring, so we're looking at that mid-May to mid-July timeframe. They're promiscuous, as I mentioned earlier. They might mate with multiple males, and males might mate with multiple females. And so if we're going to look at some of these graphics here, so this table over here shows some of the older females that have had cubs. And so we've got 2 bears at age 25 that had litters of cubs. We had Grizzly 365, which primarily hung out in the Shoshone National Forest. And then we've got Grizzly Bear 12, which had 1 cub of the year in 1981. That's kind of an iffy number right there, because we're not sure if that cub actually survived or not. But regardless of the fact, she still birthed that cub at 25 years of age. And so let's talk a little bit about delayed implantation. Everybody's probably like, what is that? I get a lot of questions about delayed implantation. So I want to talk about what it is and what it isn't. So delayed implantation is referred to as embryonic diapause, which there are 2 different types. So there's facultative and there's obligate. Bears are obligate. And so the way that I like to remember this is obligatory. So it's part of the cycle. It's genetically programmed. It's in the bear's, it's pretty much wired into the bear's mind. Whereas facultative, it's more induced by environmental conditions. And examples of those would be marsupials or small rodents. Not to confuse anybody, but common misconceptions about what delayed implantation is. So the blastocyst, nothing actually implants. That's important to know. And so there is no development between the months of May going through to November. There is no development at all. There's no fetus. And so if the female has adequate nutrition and fat stores, what'll happen is the egg will implant the uterine, or the blastocyst, not the egg, that's a typo on my part, will implant in the uterine wall and development will begin. And so implantation typically will take place in November and December. And then cubs are first born very late January going into the first weeks of February. And so people will ask, in specific regards to climate change and changing food resources, what are the ramifications for reproduction in bears? And so I'll just use whitebark pine as an example. You've got whitebark pine that's under attack from climate change for two reasons: blister rust and pine beetles. Pine beetles are not invasive. They are native to the GYE. They've been around, but the number of pine beetles is exacerbated by climate change, because without harsh winters, pine beetles will thrive. The larvae will survive, and they'll reproduce. They'll basically, overwhelm whitebark trees. They'll bore into them and kill the tree. And so why are whitebark so important to grizzly bears? Because they're a valuable nutrient-rich food source. They're very high in fat, as we talked about with nutrition. Interestingly, what research has shown is actually that years following bad production of whitebark pine, 1 cub litters with females is actually more common than 3 cub litters. And so really what research has demonstrated is that there isn't really any relationship between the ability of a female to produce cubs and the decline of whitebark pine within their home range. It shows the plasticity and the resiliency in grizzly bear reproduction to major changes in food sources. So if whitebark pine is not available, they can easily make that shift. Why has whitebark pine been so heavily studied? Well, because variation in cone production can be measured, whereas a lot of these other food sources, they've just kind of made a slight nick in the tip of the iceberg. It really merits further investigation, in my opinion. I think a lot more can be done with some of the other food resources going forward. But whitebark pine is really important to grizzly bear reproduction. And so without enough fat stores and nutrients, bears do not abort. And so this is an important differentiation. The blastocysts will absorb. And so bears do not abort because there was no development, there's no fetus, so abortion never occurs. It is absorption. And I fielded this question actually from one of our interp rangers. And I like to use absorption, not abortion, because it's easy to remember and to keep the facts straight. And so now let's talk about some of the unique reproductive life histories. We're going to talk about quad litters, cub adoptions, mixed age litters of cubs, and then we're going to talk about extended maternal care and bonding family pairs. These are all really cool, unique things that aren't typically seen, but they have been documented. And so these are just a few of the pictures that I've got for different anomalies in reproduction. So the upper left-hand picture, it's in black and white, was taken from the air during an aerial survey. That is grizzly bear 349 and her 3 young. If I go back, look at the difference in sizes of her cubs. So she's got a yearling and she's got 2 cubs of the year. And so that's what we would refer to as a mixed age litter of cubs. And so this is an extremely rare phenomenon. The way that this occurs is when the female is temporarily separated from her cub and she can go in and mate with another male while maintaining lactation and then actually return to the cub. There have been very few observations of this and very few observations of that separation time. In Alaska, they have actually documented 3 wild female grizzly bears where there was a cub separation of 9, 11, and 18 days. And then the bear would mate and actually come back. But the problem is they never actually observed a mixed age litter. And so really the observation of a mixed age litter is super rare. And it's actually 0.5% in comparison to the number of litters that have been documented. So this is grizzly bear 533 and her 3-year-old cubs. If you look at that picture, those cubs are almost as large as her. And so this is an example of a bear holding the cubs for an extended year. This is not really an anomaly so much anymore. This has been on the rise. We've been seeing more bears holding on to their cubs for an additional year. And so one of the more notable bears that has done this was the Lake Butte sow in Yellowstone on the East Entrance Road. She held her cub for another year and then eventually weaned that cub. This picture that's top row on the far right, this is grizzly bear 610. This was an example of a cub adoption event. And so she has 3 cubs here. One of those cubs is from her mother, 399. And so the craigheads were really the first to document extensively cub adoptions in Yellowstone. And between the years of 1959 and 1970, they actually documented cub adoptions on 9 different occasions. And they reported that most orphaned offspring were actually adopted by female grizzly bears that had litters. And so really natural adoption will occur where bears are congregated at food sources. During that period that the Craigheads were studying, garbage dumps were still a thing. And so what would happen is females and other demographics of bears would gather at these garbage dumps and at the pits, and resulting in errors made by the female, whether that's from confusion or stress. And sometimes they would swap, and one bear would accidentally run off with another bear's cub. So no harm, no foul. It's one of the more unique things, and we still see this to this day. And then we've got, if you go on the bottom row here on the far left, we've got a juvenile band, which is kind of interesting. People wonder, well, why do juveniles hang out with each other, after they get weaned, or sometimes they'll go their separate ways. And the rationale behind this is juvenile bands of cubs, whether yearlings or 2-year-olds, will actually rate higher in the bear social hierarchy in comparison to individual bears of their age. So it's to their advantage to actually stick together and tag team. The other really cool thing about that picture is there's actually 4 cubs there, 4 yearling cubs. And so if you look behind that middle bear, that is another bear behind it. And so if we look at the 3 remaining pictures on the bottom, we've got grizzly bear 125 with her 3 cubs of the year. And so that's her right there. Interestingly enough, 125 and grizzly bear 665 are related. 665 is the daughter of 125. And so this is 665 after the cub swap. She's got 4 cubs there. Might be a little bit difficult to see. The image isn't the best. And then we've got grizzly bear 125 or 665 with her 2 koi before swapping. So another really cool thing. And so then if we're going to talk about litters of 4, so a lot of people think that, 399 is the first bear to ever have a litter of 4 cubs, or she's the first bear to successfully rear all 4 cubs through her first year. And that's really not the case. Quad litters are really a rarity still, but they're on the rise. And there is an explanation for that. And so it's known that with litter sizes increasing with the age of the female, capture records over the last 3 decades have shown that the longevity of females is going up. So females are living longer. And so it's, in comparison to 1959 and 1970, 112 litters, only 3 quad litters were observed. Whereas from 1973 till now, we've got 613 litters, only 10 litters of quadruplets. That's not including Grizzly 399 in 2020. But only 10 litters of quadruplets documented in that time frame, and 8 of those have been documented since 2009. And so as we get further along, it's likely that we will see a rise in quad litters in the GYE, just because of what I had previously mentioned with the past 3 decades of capture records showing that bears are living longer. And that litter sizes actually will increase with the age of the female. A historical breakdown. So if we go down to the bottom here, this little table, we've got the three litters that were documented by the Craigheads, 1962, 66, and 67. And so 1966 and 1967, the Craigheads actually observed both of those litters. All 4 cubs made it to yearlings, and all 4 cubs were weaned. So both of those litters were successful and went out on the landscape. Whereas if we look at some of the bears, the litters that have been observed from 1990 through 2020, we've got 1 bear in 2009, which was Grizzly 279. She had all 4, but she lost a cub. And then in 2010, the notable quad mom that called Swan Lake Flats her home for a long time. 2019, so most recently we've had Grizzly bear 786. She started with a litter of 4 and lost a cub. And then 2020, we've got 399, and she's got all 4 cubs still alive as of January 1st of this year. And if we're looking at some of the pictures on the right-hand side of the slide, that top picture is a quadruplet litter that was observed at Trout Creek. The second one down is 399 and her 4. The third picture from the top is actually, those are 4 2-year-olds. Those were observed just, I want to say probably 10 to 15 miles southwest of Cook City. And so this is one litter that was not documented by the study team. So this litter was actually photographed in 2016 during October when a gentleman was out shed hunting, and he sent that picture to me. And then we've got the 2 bottom litters there. So we have the bear that's in color on the second from the bottom. That is actually the same litter as the one on the bottom. And so those bears were successfully raised to 2 years old and weaned. Pair bonding. So this is a really cool thing that a lot of people don't know about. So there is such a thing as bonded adult female bonding. And so it's a strong social relationship when you get 2 family groups and they decide to basically mesh together. And so the Craigheads, what they found is during the 1970s, it was the disruptive effects of closing the garbage dumps abruptly that led to family bonding. And so the bonding behavior, there was actually a biological advantage and benefit to family groups tag teaming and staying together. And it was really during times of stress. So when food sources were all of a sudden turned upside down, which is what happened when they closed the open pit refuse dumps, bears started going into campgrounds. There was immediately documented mortalities much higher than previous years. And so female groups were that was the highest year on record, was 1970. And I know that a lot of people this year in Grand Teton, 399 and 610, they shared a field together for some time, and they came within an arm's reach of each other, which was pretty interesting. But they also follow each other around. They know the landscape very well, and they share some of the similar food sources. So bear behavior, you could say it's black and white, but don't forget the gray matter. And so we're talking about bear brains. And why are bear brains so important? Well, because olfaction. And what is olfaction? Well, we're talking about the sense of smell in bears in particular. And so most of the attention on bear neurology has been placed on their special sense of smell. And so Dr. George Stevenson was a neurosurgeon, and he actually spent his life's work trying to develop an atlas of grizzly bear and black bear brain anatomy. And so he actually just recently passed away, but he spent his entire career researching bear brains. And so these are 3 of his images. And so in the red boxes, that's what we would refer to as the olfactory bulb. And so in comparison to a human brain, which is on this slide, we're going to look at the olfactory bulbs. And where do you see those on a human? Well, they're tucked underneath. They're not nearly the size that humans have. And so if we're talking about bear brains, bears have about a 9-inch nose, and those olfactory bulbs have millions of nerve endings that connect there. And so that sends information to the brains. And so now let's make some comparisons. So if we're talking about a bloodhound versus a human, a bloodhound has about a 300-time greater sense of smell than the average human being. A bear in comparison to a bloodhound, well, a bear has got about it's about 7 times greater than that of a bloodhound. So bears it's about 2,100 times the sense of smell as the average human being, if you do the math, which is pretty remarkable. One of the pieces of literature that's out there and available, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Great Bear Almanac. There is a specific section in that book where it actually describes a California black bear traveling upwind 3 miles to find the carcass of a dead deer. And so that speaks to the nose of the bear. Some estimates, and these are kind of, I don't know if I fully agree with them, but say the bears can smell up to 18 and 20 miles, polar bears up to 40 miles when they're looking for seals. Really, the sense of smell is something that's difficult to quantify, and it's extremely variable. It's a very difficult thing to put a nail on. And so these images, I'm just going to say, are courtesy of the University of Wisconsin and Michigan State Comparative Lab for Mammalian Brain Collections. And so I was able to acquire these images from there. Making a stiff transition over to what are these holes in the ground? These are where bears spend most of their time during the winter. So these are bear dens. We've got one that's on the far left, which is dug at the base of a tree. The one in the middle is a cave, and then the one on the far right is an actual cave as well. Both of those are natural cavities, as opposed to a dug den, the one on the left. And so what's important to note about bear denning, it's instinctual. So it's instinct for a bear to dig a den. The location is largely maternally influenced, so it's learned behavior. Most dens are actually excavated. So 91% of grizzly bear dens are excavated, 6% are natural cavities, and 3% are snow. Den construction can take anywhere between 3 and 7 days. And during that period of time, bears can move up to 2,000 pounds of dirt. It's really remarkable. Not all dens are the same. There's really a large range in elevation where you'll find them, 6,500 to 10,000 feet on 30 to 60 degree slopes. And the orientation of the den is usually, it's oriented in a manner where the snow will actually insulate the den during the winter from extreme temperatures. And so this is an aerial flight image of a grizzly bear that is moved quite a bit of dirt. And if you actually look where that red square is, you can see where the bear is popping its head out of the den. And so that is probably 2,000 pounds of dirt right there. Quite a bit of dirt. If we're talking about timeframes for how long bears will den for, and when they'll go into dens. So females are typically the first ones in their dens. And that's usually by the first week of November. Other females, it's about the second week of November. And then that's about the same for males too. When they come out, so females with cubs of the year are usually the last to come out, and that's on average the 4th week of April. Other females, it's the 3rd week. And then males are obviously the first out of their dens, and on average they'll emerge the 4th week of March. And so during hibernation, another really cool thing, their heart rate is about 40 to 50 beats per minute active, and during hibernation it drops to about 8 to 19 beats per minute. So there's a substantial drop there. And so ongoing research. So there's a lot of ongoing research right now with grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone. I'm just going to focus on some of the stuff that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of, which is the elk reduction program in Grand Teton National Park. The elk hunter interaction research, really what started it was an elk hunter was mauled in 2011. And then 2012, a grizzly bear was killed by an elk hunter. And so during 2013, Grand Teton National Park and the U.S. Geological Survey came together and they submitted a proposal. And that during 2014, that study design and they was approved, and they acquired funding for the program. The objectives of this program were to look at the changes in grizzly bear distribution and density on the landscape during the hunt, and look at the distribution of elk remains, grizzly bear use of the elk remains, and then what is the risk of conflict between bears and hunters on the landscape. So some of the information that we acquired during this time, we identified 31 grizzly bears during 2014 and 15. Most were males, and this was all done through genetic hair sampling. So we set wires up on the landscape, and bears will rub on them. So there's passive, there's a lot of different methods to acquire hair. If we look at the image on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a bear on a natural rub tree. And so we would put wires on trees like that, or what we would do is we would have a scent pit, and then we would run a wire around the perimeter, and bears would have to pass through that wire. And then we would acquire hair through those wires. The data that we found actually suggested that because the elk hunt in Grand Teton is so late in the year, it reduces the number of bears that would traditionally come from areas surrounding Grand Teton. So really, the late timing of the hunt limits the use of elk remains to basically all resident grizzly bears. And so this is still ongoing. We're using GPS collars and GPS units with hunters to look at the interaction between bears and hunters on the landscape. And so what is the primary motive? Like, why is all of this important? And really, the reason it's important is because we want to better understand how grizzly bears respond to this elk harvest. Grand Teton is not the only park to allow a hunt like this, but it is important for us to understand the long-term and the short-term effects of what this could mean for conflict between grizzly bears and hunters within a national park. And so really, we're looking to use this information to make science-based decisions to reduce the risk of encounters between hunters and bears. And so another project that's going on in Yellowstone right now is the reevaluation of bear management areas. And so you might be wondering, what are bear management areas? These are areas that are seasonally or I'll say seasonally close to the public for entry. And it's basically to minimize and reduce bear and human interactions, which could lead to inherent habituation. Habituation is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but really these areas are just off limits to people to try to decrease the risk of human injury when there's high levels of bear activity, whether that's because of food sources or it's migratory routes for ungulates, and we're just trying to prevent unnecessary human-bear interaction. There's also a study that was previously conducted looking at the genetic connectivity between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the Greater Yellowstone. And you can look that up on Google. It's Peck is actually the author, and I believe it was published in 2014. And so if we're going to talk about conservation reliance, this kind of ties into the Endangered Species Act a little bit. And I'm not going to read these quotes, verbatim, word by word, but I just want to cover what is conservation reliance, what is a conservation reliant species. And so species are conservation reliant if they're vulnerable to persistent threats that require consistent and continued management or intervention in order to prevent catastrophic decline or extinction, or maybe even the possibility where the population needs to just constantly be maintained in order to have adequate levels. Management actions are typically intended to increase or stabilize population size and distribution, or to reduce the rate of decline. So when we use the term management action, that's what we're referring to. Without intervention, sometimes species would decline, and that's particularly true for the grizzly bear. Conservation reliance acknowledges that monitoring and continued management are necessary, and species may recover and no longer become conservation reliant. Unfortunately, that is not going to be the case with the Greater Yellowstone grizzly bear. Threats will persist, and the species will remain conservation reliant even if the population decline is halted. And that's kind of where bears are at right now. And so this particular quote I really like, and it's the grizzly bear, the Yellowstone grizzly has been known and referred to as a conservation reliant species, meaning a species at risk from threats so persistent that it requires management to maintain stable population levels. And that's from Chuck Schwartz, who was previously the head research ecologist for the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. And really, so he alluded to the fact that it's the population that's really, that we're looking at from a population standpoint. We're not managing individual bears per se, but we're looking at the population levels. And so this is a really good book that just came out in 2020. It's called Shepherding Nature. This particularly focuses on the challenge of conservation reliance, and it talks about the California condor, a lot of species, particularly birds that have been subject to conservation reliance and that have been listed on the Endangered Species Act over time. Really goes into depth in talking about the policy as well. And so these are, I know these might be difficult to see. These are all historic pictures that were taken during the Craighead era, so between 1959 and 1970, with the exception of the bottom left-hand picture with the bears on the feeding pit. And so most of these pictures, with the exception of the bottom right, were taken at the Otter Creek bear platform. And so if you look at some of these pictures, you might see people that are sitting on bleachers. And why is that? Because there used to be bear shows. So park managers used to dump refuse and they used to dump garbage. And they used to invite the public to come and watch the bears feed on the garbage. And so this practice ceased in 1942, specifically at Otter Creek, which most of these pictures are from. But you can see how bears they're not territorial at all. They're all feeding, at these garbage pits. They're putting on a show for these people. But really the problem was, even though the bear shows had ended, the refuse sites remained active. And so the park was still able to adequately handle waste from an increasing visitation, and it just increased garbage from park facilities. Increased visitation led to an increase in use in facilities. They just were overwhelmed with the ability to handle garbage. And this was the park's way of handling its garbage at the point in time. And honestly, a fed bear was not always a dead bear. And that's, we can learn from history, and that's an important learning lesson. If we look at what Otter Creek looks like now, these are pictures of what it looks like now. And so there is still a feeding platform. You can still find it. There's not really much there. There's nothing left. There's no garbage. You might find a ceramic crock or some of the, what is remaining of the chain linked fence that used to separate visitors from the feeding platform. But it's quite humbling if you've ever gotten the chance to see it, and just the advances that we've made over time. And so really this goes into the conflict side. People always ask, well, what can I do? What can you do to prevent conflict? And what can I do? What is my part in the grand scheme of things? And really, I'm going to be blunt about it. Bears aren't the problem. A lot of times it's humans. And I think a lot of us know that. We are the root issue. The bears are not. And so really good quote. There's no question that it's possible for people and bears to coexist without serious problems if we're willing to manage our food and garbage. And this was said by Steve Herrero, who's studied bears for many years. He's one of the leading experts in the field. He's written quite a few books. Bear Attacks is probably one of the more notable publications that he's put out. But really, it's garbage and food. If there's anything that you can do, it's making sure that your food's stored properly. Or in these pictures, for instance, we see a bear that's chewing on somebody's camera tripod, or we see a bear that's, approached with pushing its nose to somebody's car window, or a cooler that has been completely chewed apart. Bear resistant does not mean bear proof. So do not leave coolers unattended. Do not leave, items that might have food in them available to a bear, because they are opportunists. They will take advantage of you. And so if I go back, and the bottom picture here, that's what happens when a black bear gets into a picnic. And it may seem funny, but it's really not, because the ultimate end is that the bear pays the price with its life. And so don't feed the bears. It's as simple as that. Feeding wildlife is illegal in the national parks. You can and will be prosecuted for it. People enjoy seeing bears. There's no doubt about it. It's very exciting. However, when they're around human developments, it's really important that we don't allow them to linger. So it's really important to be proactive about it. A lot of people are scared to call management because they're worried that something bad's going to happen about the bear. And that's not the case. Take the proactive approach, not after something's already happened, because if you're proactive about it, we might be able to save that bear before it gets into further trouble. Report all bear activity so that action can be taken. Stay ahead of the curve. That's really important. This might seem like a really cute picture. This has been going around social media. You've got a black bear that's sticking its head through a dog door. And really, I can't emphasize enough, pet food too. So if you're in an area like Colorado, or even, Wyoming, Montana, wherever it is, pet food is a major driver too. Bears love pet food. So no, we don't want that happening. That is not cute. Don't let him inside. You want to contact somebody as soon as possible. Make sure that kind of behavior does not persist. And so people living, working, and recreating need to consider the presence of grizzly bears, and I will add black bears, in the West. And so some of the stuff that we can do, wildlife and land management practices can change. For example, storage of food and other attractants. Hunting is a good one. When I meet with hunters, I like to say and suggest that they use a gutless method when they are dealing with their elk or when they're dealing with their mule deer. And the last bullet I've got is policy, regulations, and enforcement. We can have all the law and the rule in the world, but if we can't enforce it, then it's no use. And so that's really important. If we can't enforce the laws that we have, adding additional laws and regulation is not going to do anything. And so some of the other things that I'll add here, the term problem bear, over the last decade, it's gone away. As managers, we've gone away from using that term, and we like to use human wildlife or human bear conflict. because that title largely implies that we play a part. And that's important for us to recognize. Unfortunately, you know, ultimately the bear pays the price with its life a lot of times if it's a serious food issue. But why is that? Because food conditioned bears are dangerous. Food conditioned bears and habituated bears are two separate categories. Habituation is neither good nor bad. Food conditioning is dangerous because what happens is bears associate food with people. They associate food with vehicles, outbuildings, whatever it is. And that's when it becomes dangerous, is when they lose, when they start to come in, and or if that attractant is removed and they start to break in. That's why it's important to be proactive about it. So don't place food in open windows outside. Clean your grills, keep garbage and recycled materials, you know, out of the open. If you've got the ability to have a bear-proof or a bear-resistant garbage can, that's always recommended. You know, keep your doors, windows locked. Bears can open doors, contrary to belief. They're smart. They can open car doors too. But really, the last thing that I really want to hit on this slide with conflict is what you can do is situational awareness in terms of conflict with people. Make noise when you're in the woods. It's one thing. You've got two different types of people. You've got people that make a lot of noise, and you got people that don't make any noise, and they think that bear spray is their coverall. And really, that's something that you've got to consider. So your situational awareness, being in tune with your surroundings, you know, observing, making sure that you're not just going to randomly stumble upon a bear. They will know that you're there before you know that they are there. But it's important that you don't surprise them. And so that's when most conflict occurs. If we're looking at the pie charts over here, the primary sources of human-caused mortalities from 1975 to 2018, most are food and trash security and conflicts with hunters. Both of those areas can be improved. And so with food and trash security, food storage, conflicts with hunters, obviously hunters on the landscape are being stealthy a lot of times, which is what leads to surprise encounters. And then if we're looking at documented mortalities for independent bears, so any grizzly bear that's 4 years or older, it's all human cause. 85% is human cause. A very, very small portion of bears are actually dying from natural causes, unfortunately. And so that's something to really, really think about. And so that's a quote from Carrie Gunther regarding habituation. It's not good or bad. It is simply an adaptable behavior that is inevitable when bears and other wildlife are exposed and frequent benign encounters with large numbers of people. And this is in reference to the roadways, so bear viewing opportunities. In the national parks with high visitation, some habituation to bears and people is inevitable and may be necessary if bears are to survive in the park units increasingly dominated by humans. And so this is something that's really important as we start to see increases in visitation, you know, over the last decade and in future years to come. That's important to note. And so what does the future of Yellowstone grizzlies look like? So nearly 50 years of recovery. It's what we consider a conservation success, probably one of the greatest that we'll see in our lifetime. Grizzly bears have met the recovery goals and the criteria established by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are considered essentially ecologically and biologically recovered. I like to call it, you know, from garbage to grizzly gospel. It's a tremendous recovery. And by recovery, we're talking about bringing an imperiled species back from the brink of extinction and making sure that it's a viable and sustainable wild population. And so bears are in areas that they haven't occupied in the last century, but the same goes for people. And so people are in areas that they weren't 100 years ago. And so coexistence and understanding bear behavior and wildlife in general are crucial for ensuring the continued success of grizzly bear conservation. And so really what I'm going to conclude on here is understanding delisting. And so I've always got a really bad taste in my mouth when I have people come and talk to me about delisting and what the Endangered Species Act is. The intent of the Endangered Species Act is to provide a framework, and that's to conserve and protect endangered or threatened species, and recover them, bring them back from the brink of extinction. Also, you know, help secure their habitat. The inevitable reality is that grizzly bears will eventually be delisted in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and the Endangered Species Act takes what we refer to as a biocentric perspective on things, which means that it values the species over the economy. Now, what's wrong with that? Because you've got people that might have an anthropocentric perception. And so where they see the economy as being more important with the species, and they think that the Endangered Species Act is just wrong. And as a manager, you want to try to meet that middle ground. You want to try to, come meet both parties in the middle. It's really important not to let emotion or anything like that dictate what science should be. And so legally, the species has met or exceeded recovery goals. And so it's really doing the Endangered Species Act a disservice if grizzly bears are unnecessarily listed. You're taking attention away from other species that may not be your characteristic megafauna, like grizzly bears are. And so it's really important. It's a very contentious issue, I know, amongst a lot of people. And so the important thing is that understand that the Endangered Species Act has done wonders for the grizzly bear in Yellowstone. And they have biologically recovered. A lot of people think that the Endangered Species Act is going to prevent grizzly bears from being hunted. And my comment to that is you can still delist the Yellowstone grizzly bears. And if the general public does not want to hunt, you can take up additional legislative action. You can write your legislator, you can get together with a group of people and put together a proposal. There are other avenues. If we unnecessarily keep bears listed, what will happen is the Endangered Species Act will lose its teeth, and it won't have the same effect for other species going forward. And really, the future of grizzly bears rests with everybody on this call, and a lot of other people. And so that's important to know. The future of bears lies with you. And what I mean by that is your vote matters. Getting out and voting in favor of the bears, recognizing when sometimes unpopular decisions are made, and just facing adversity with the bears. It's a very contentious issue. And so I'm just going to briefly, some of the work that I've worked on the last couple of years, aside from professional stuff, the bear charts. And so I put together, I'm really big on educating the public and educating people that are ursophiles, as Jim would like to call them. So bear enthusiasts, people that love bears. And so I put together the family charts. And that is it basically is a citizen science project where we compile together all the observations each year from visitors, tourists, anybody that wants to contribute, and we differentiate family groups. And so that's what that chart does, is it shows all the family groups documented in a given year to our knowledge. And we try to get photographs of as many family groups as possible. And then we try to identify, if the bear is collared, if the bear is tagged, who the bear is, what kind of life history does that bear have. The other two educational documents that I've put together, identifying grizzly bears and Yellowstone grizzly bear range and movements. And so identifying grizzly bears, it's largely for people that, might have a difficult time differentiating between black bears and grizzly bears. It does also provide some information on collar data and, why grizzly bears are wearing collars, ear tags, how to identify different scarring patterns. And then the grizzly bear range and movements chart. It just kind of talks about some really cool information in regards to range and movements. And then on the flip side of that, which I don't have, is what we call the Yellowstone grizzly bear tracker. So it shows all the different family groups that were actually visibly observed during a given year. And so two of the things that I've worked on for my master's, estimating observational home ranges for grizzly bears. Basically what that entails is looking at visitor data. So you submit all of this information and we put it together, and we look at home range sizes based on observations of females with cubs. And then the other project that I've worked on is called the boomerang effect, the back and forth relentless debate over how to effectively manage grizzly bears. And that really dives into a comprehensive policy analysis, looking at the Endangered Species Act and grizzly bears. And so I just want to give a special thanks. I want to thank Jim. Jim has been a great mentor to me and a great colleague over the many years that we've worked together. And I want to thank him for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. George Clokey, he runs the Yellowstone travel study from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Had it not been for George, I would have never met Jim. And so I really thank both of them for that. I want to thank my boss, Kate Wilmot. in Grand Teton, Dave Gustine, who's now the polar bear team lead for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, Carrie Gunther and Eric Reinertson for really getting my foot in the door with volunteering in bear management in Yellowstone National Park. And then I want to thank Craig Whitman, who has taught me everything that I need to know about grizzly bear trapping and handling bears and how to, handle bears with respect. And really a special thanks to everybody on this call. I appreciate everybody that's willing to listen to me ramble on about my continued enthusiasm about bears. And so now I'm just going to open up for any questions that people might have. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Hey, Tyler, I got a question.
Sure.
You can hear me, I guess.
I can hear you, yep.
I'm just curious how things are looking as far as bears headed south, grizzly bears, like down in the Star Valley where I live.
It's it's going to be interesting how the next couple of years play out, even the next decade. We're seeing bears, grizzly bears in particular, down south of town. A lot of them are at this point subadult males, so they're just kind of dispersing. It will be really interesting to see how things play out if 399 raises all 4 cubs and where they go, because we could have a situation where all 4 of those cubs are subadult males, and I would really like to hope not. But if they're all subadult males, they might go off like a pinball machine and just shoot all over the place. But right now, the Star Valley area, even the flip side going into Victor or Driggs in Idaho, there have been a couple grizzly bears that have been seen in those areas. I don't think that there's a real established segment yet. But I mean, I definitely think that if recovery continues at the rate that it's going and distribution and range continue to expand, you'll probably see bears there definitely within the next decade or 2 decades, maybe even sooner.
Yeah, I know they've been sighted even south of here, down around Fontenelle Reservoir and Kemmer and stuff. But I would love to see a little population get down this way. I don't know how the locals react and everything, but
absolutely.
And I would love to help you guys in any way I can, Jim, or you, Tyler, in your research. If I could donate any kind of drawings or anything like that, I'd be more than welcome. I just wanted you guys to know, and I appreciate you doing this stuff because I love learning all I can about bears.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Doug.
You bet.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So we've visited several conservation areas. So why do bears in those conservation, like Bearzona, and there's one here in Arizona, where they don't den, but bears in the wild do? So why does that happen?
So there are some segments of wild bears that don't den. And so if we're looking at, for instance, Florida, black bears in Florida, females will den, but some males will stay out. It's not a real cookie cutter. So not all bears are going to den. Really, denning is a mechanism to conserve energy. So bears are not, it's to protect them. And if they're out on the landscape during the winter, there's not really an abundance of food. When it gets super cold, the power to dig a hole is really powerful. And so those bears are just looking to conserve energy and try to survive through winter. If that kind of climate or if that's not present where they need to den, they can stay out year round. We've had bears that have stayed out year round in Montana because they've had a food source available to them. In particular, there was a set of bears, a family of bears that actually stayed in a silo all winter and fed on grain. And so obviously it's not an ideal situation, but that kind of presents the general concept that yes, they can stay out if they want to, if there's food available for them. And then as far as Arizona goes, again, it's the climate component. So if there isn't a need to den, then the bears won't. If there's food available year round, they'll be able to stay out.
I know in Bearzona, I don't think they den, but I know the bears in the Out of Africa Zoo Park do. And then we were at Southwest Conservation Society, and they didn't den at all. But man, there was a 500-pound, was he brown? He was huge. And apparently they put him on a peanut butter, couldn't have any more peanut butter. And I will tell you, he let the world know he could not have his peanut butter and was not happy at all.
Hi, would like to ask a question.
Sure.
Yes, I was reading over the winter about bears that were showing up around Jackson, and I'm what has been the resolution of that?
It's been a slow, painful one, I think. I think the biggest issue was that we had I think, and I'll speak to a particular incident that I think you might be referencing, of a habitual feeding event at somebody's property in a subdivision near Jackson. The individual has been feeding wildlife for decades, unfortunately. And so it's one of these situations where the area in Teton, so Teton County has what we refer to as an LDR, so they're land development regulations. And we have 2 conflict priority zones. And so those conflict priority zones, basically they outline that you can't feed wildlife in those zones. And unfortunately, this woman was, there's no other way she was breaking the law by habitually feeding wildlife, whether it's moose, deer, bears, whatever. And the problem with feeding wildlife that a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, it may seem cute, but it's indiscriminate. So when you put food out, you might be targeting one species and another species actually might be feeding on whatever you're putting out. And so that the big picture of it is that feeding in general is not a good thing. Being in close contact with bears, sure, it might be cool, but ultimately it's disrespectful to the bear because the bear is going to pay for it with its life eventually.
So was this $3.99 then with her cubs?
$3.99 and her 4 cubs were observed at this property feeding on molasses grain. As for other bears too, I got a curious itch and I started to look back at some of the bears that might have gone into that area, and it's painful because she's not the only one. Really, she's the one that brought this to light. And so it's a good thing that I think somebody finally had the itch to report this to the press, and really, the whole process took place, and it really drew a huge spotlight on the issue. And hopefully, it seems like the district courts they chose not to prosecute this woman because they didn't think that she was violating the Endangered Species Act. However, she was breaking county code compliance. And so the Teton County compliance officer did put her on notice. So she needed to cease feeding the animals, or she could potentially receive a citation. Unfortunately, I don't think that's enough. I think it's going to be a lot more that's going to come from the homeowners association in that area. They've already sued her once. And so it's creating a public issue because you're bringing grizzly bears into a property. You've got families out on a walk. And when people are getting chased around by bears that are feeding, it's just not good. And I know one family in particular that was out on the walk, and it wasn't $3.99, but it was another bear, and the bear ran them off. And they weren't doing anything, but the bear felt particularly aggressive around the food. And so I don't know if there is a resolution in sight, but I would encourage you to write the Teton County Code Compliance Officer. You can find his information on the internet. Write these people and get them involved and let them know that feeding wildlife shouldn't be tolerated, and that ultimately it's a disservice to wildlife.
Thank you.
Hey Tyler, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you describe a little more in detail when you refer to gutless hunting?
Yes, I saw that somebody somebody had noted that in the chat feature. So the gutless method. So basically it refers to, it's difficult to explain. If I had I could show you a picture of how it's done, but basically what this refers to as, when you are field dressing an elk or a mule deer, you're keeping the gut sac in one, you're keeping it in one like lump group, as opposed to having it spread out. And so there is a way to keep that gut sac intact. We actually will do that when we are quartering animals or trying to get rid of animals. That is the best way to keep everything together and to keep it from getting messy. But it also, by keeping that gut sac intact, that also reduces the smell. If you pop that and, you know, the scent starts wafting over the landscape, you're going to draw a lot of attention to yourself. And so that's what you're trying to avoid. Obviously, the like I mentioned earlier, the element of stealth is something that leads to a lot of surprise encounters. The last thing you need is a bear to come up on you and not even realizing it because you are elbow deep in an elk or a mule deer carcass. So that gutless method basically keeps that gut sac intact, reduces the smell. And so that's what we recommend. That's what we recommended during the mountain goat removal program. In Grand Teton, we recommended that hunters do a gutless approach.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Tyler, it's Andrew Langford. And
hi.
I've got a question. You showed an image of a sow bear with cubs of two different ages, 2 different years.
Yes. Yeah.
And mentioned that this mother had birthed the litters in 2 successive years, I believe.
Yep, that's correct.
I just wondered how well documented that is, because I wondered if, you know, it seems more likely that could occur through an adoption. And so just wondered if it was actually documented that. Yeah.
And so that was something that, so Mark Haraldson and John Swenson wrote a paper on this. And that was something that they did note when they went into the discussion section, and they were talking about what is the plausibility of it potentially being a cub adoption. And they thought that the likelihood was extremely low. Reason being, when this was a radio marked bear, so they were able to follow it. And so the periods when that bear was not observed, it likely, based on those timeframes, are what they were using to kind of draw the consensus as to that mixed age litter. They first watched that bear come out of the den with a yearling and then the 2 cubs of the year. Interestingly enough, with that specific litter, those 2 cubs of the year actually perished, and it was only the yearling that survived. But I don't remember in particular the rationale that Mark Haraldson gave for it. I could definitely send you that information though via email, because he had a very good explanation as to how they were able to differentiate why they thought it was a mixed age litter as opposed to an adoption event.
Okay, that'd be great if you could send that along. It just seems
we've twice observed here in Yellowstone females putting cubs up the year and mating with another male at the same time, and we've seen females come out with mixed age litters differing by a year.
Okay, reproductive biology would suggest that would be a difficult thing, but it's possible.
Yeah, the maintaining the most interesting thing, and the thing that hangs up on a lot of it gets a lot of people hung up, is being able to maintain lactation during that period when they are separated and going off to breed with another male. But Mark had a really good explanation for that, and so I can definitely send you that paper. I thought it's such a rarity with the mixed age litters, and it is certainly something that they did note when they put this. It was a short communications paper when they put it together. It was something that they addressed, just because it's so infrequent that it's really hard to get good information on this. and actually making and confirming visual identifications of this event happening are like near impossible. And
yeah,
so
it'd be nice to have some DNA evidence, but
sure,
I know that's difficult to get.
yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the time change probably got me here late. Is this something that is being recorded that I could watch after?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This is being recorded. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes here.
Very good. Thank you.
Hey, Tyler, it's Eric. I was a little curious. You had a slide earlier, and it had all the bears, and it showed 399 and a lot of her cubs. And so I was a little curious, when you guys are collecting the fur and you're looking at teeth and you're gathering DNA, are you able to find which boars are more likely to be the true breeder boars? We have a matriarch with 399. Do we have a patriarch with a boar like Brutus?
Yes. I think, I mean, as far as with her lineage in particular, there are certain bears that pop out more than others. Obviously, Bruno, Brutus, the two big male bears that we see quite often in the northern section of Grand Teton. They are what I would call, the real drivers as far as male bears go. They kind of run the show. There have been a couple other bears that are out on the periphery of the park. And when I say periphery, I mean in the Bridger Teton, that do occasionally come in and they scully in, and their genetics are kind of mixed in. In reference to how we're able to differentiate, who sires those litters. The parentage it's probability based. So the interesting component with that is, because it's probability based, you could have one bear that's all of a sudden captured and enters the picture, and it can throw your probability upside down as to, the plausibility of one male versus another male being related to, X, Y, and Z. It can really throw a wrench into things. But we've got dyads and triads when we refer to genetics. And so dyads would be that we've got DNA on the bear that's been captured, and one of its, it would either be its mother or its father. And then triad would refer to that we've got genetic DNA on both the mother, father, and the offspring. And so a lot of bears, we've got situations where it's a dyad, but we don't have any information on the father, or we might not have any information on the mother. It's possible that we've got bears out there running that have been going for 20, 30 years, and we haven't captured them or handled them or got DNA on them yet. We do have, I'm just thinking the last couple of years, we had one bear that was estimated at over 20 years old, and that bear had never been sampled before. And so that's it's an interesting component. There's a lot more bears on the landscape than I think we know of. And so the genetic opportunity for some of these males to mix in, especially in Grand Teton right now, it's gonna be really cool in the next couple of years to see what happens.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing more data comes out, especially if you guys are able to capture and get DNA from 2020's litter with 399 and see
Absolutely.
if that was, more than one's father.
Absolutely. Yeah, that will be interesting. And I know that I can, she has had litters that have been sired by multiple bears, multiple males. And so I'm trying to remember, there have been other bears that we've documented too, that have had 2 or 3 males that have sired the cubs of a litter, which is pretty remarkable. So especially when you think about a litter size on average being 2 to 3, having all 3 cubs have 3 different fathers is pretty wild.
I think we could ask you questions all night, Tyler. You probably need to just have a Q&A. I was curious. I just had a curiosity. I remember a comment. I thought it was from you. I was trying to find it about 610, that you you or someone from the team had said you weren't sure that 610 was actually 610. People referred to her as 610, but there was a gap in tracking. And I was just curious if you could comment on that. And then just one other thing I was curious about 399, you mentioned that the females go to den in November typically, and she was out until January 1st. Do you think that's due to her size of litter, her condition going in, or do you have any theories around that? Thanks.
Yeah. So I guess with the 610 situation, we just like to play, we like to be extra conservative and extra cautious in our approach. And so I think one of the things that we want to avoid is identifying individual bears, because it takes away from the larger picture, which is the entire population. And so I think there's a hesitance to identify individual bears as opposed to it just being a bear. That being said, it's very difficult to say that it was or was not 610 because she lost her ear tags, and she didn't really have any physically identifying features that would differentiate her in terms of like a hard scientific basis. So if we could find like, unique scars or anything like that, it might be a little bit easier. Most likely it is 610, just given her movements and looking at, how she interacted with 399 and some of 399's offspring. There's definitely a behavioral component there that would suggest that it is 610. It's just, we don't want to, obviously, from a scientific basis, we don't want to jump the gun and say that it is her if we don't have hard evidence, and that taking the form of DNA, whether that's through hair or through scat. And then in terms of, 399 going to den so late, she did that with her last litter too. I believe she was out through the end of December when she had her last two kids. And so there's an availability in Grand Teton. If I were to show you a graphic that would show you activity patterns, you would see that bears in Grand Teton actually stay out slightly longer than bears in Yellowstone. And that's probably directly related to the hunt that takes place in the park. Those gut piles are an important food source for female grizzly bears in particular. And so that constant availability of food on a daily basis is what will keep them out longer.
Thank you. I appreciate your time tonight.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this program. If you like the program, we have a channel on YouTube. Go to YouTube and search for Gathering of Naturalists. You may also visit our website at tracknature.com, where you'll find our books, classes, and other products. Our books are available on amazon.com. Again, thank you for joining us. And this is Jim Halfpenny. Take care, my friends.